Representative Burgess, Commissioner Craddock, we're honored that you're here with us today. And I want to start with a question for both of you. You've been at the forefront of some of the biggest domestic energy policy debates, questions from securing energy independence in the face of global turmoil, to creating a resilient grid that can sustain natural disasters, to questions about the energy transition and ensuring that we have a stable and reliable supply of oil and gas here in the United States. In your view, what are some of the key building blocks of a good domestic energy policy? And why don't we start with you, Commissioner Craddock?
Well, good morning, and thank you for having me. And it's nice to sit on a panel with somebody who understands energy and in Congress, because some days that's a bit of a challenge. So it's nice to be here today. So when you're talking about I think domestic energy policy, look, all of the above works for Texas. In fact, I tell people you ought to look and see what Texas is doing, because we're doing it better probably than anybody else in the world, and I think the best in the country. And part of that, when you're looking at energy policy, is letting innovation occur. The reason I believe Texas has been so successful, we've got a good regulatory body, but the innovation that's starting, and I always say this on this campus, and I did go to school here, so I can crib it, but what starts here changes the world. What is happening in Texas, whether it's today's fracking or where we started 100 years ago in oil and gas, we really are changing the world, and I think domestic policy needs to look like what states are doing instead of what the federal government does. A lot of times one size doesn't always fit all, but we don't have a domestic energy policy, and I think that's not necessarily a bad thing. It's allowing innovation, but I think Texas does a great job.
Well, again, thank you for allowing me to be here. Thanks to Senator Hutchinson for including me in this meeting today. I do sit on the Energy and Commerce Committee. I've been there on the committee since 2005 and have seen some of the big energy policy bills come through that committee. In 2005, the Energy Policy Act of 2005 passed. If you'll remember, back in 2005, one of the big concerns across the country was we do not have enough natural gas. Natural gas is going to have to be imported from the North Sea. And in order to get that natural gas off of those big ships from the North Sea, we are going to have terminals sited for the offloading of liquefied natural gas. The Energy Policy Act of 2005 was designed to let FERC, the Federal Energy Resource Commission, site those offshore, those ramps to offshore that gas around in various places in the country. But we also had a policy that, in fact, allowed the release of gas from the tight shale formations to go forward and to not overly regulate that. And as a consequence of that policy, natural gas suddenly went from scarcity to abundance. And not to worry, we can take those offloading sites for North Sea natural gas, liquefied natural gas produced in this country, and export it to other countries that need it. And that is exactly what happened. It took a long time for that to come to fruition, but that was part and parcel of the Energy Policy Act of 2005. So those two things, citing those export facilities for liquefied natural gas and providing the baseline that there would be no regulation on fracking, would not be over-regulation on fracking to allow the gas to be produced. In 2015, although it was part of an appropriations bill, it was policy that was actually heard in our committee, which lifted the ban on the export of crude oil. And of all of the things that have happened during the time that I've been in the United States House of Representatives, you look at any measure of economic activity in this country, whether it be employment, whether it be GDP, there is an inflection point right after that ban was lifted. So that was December of 2015. Most of those graphs start up in 2016, and in fact, until the coronavirus hit, did not look back. So I understand that what happens with the Energy Policy Committee can have a profound effect upon how energy is produced for this country. So the HR 1, which I literally just walked off the floor from voting for that onto an airplane to come down here, it is going to substantially change predominantly in the realm of permitting, and we'll get into that some later on. But these are the types of policies that allow that all of the above strategy. And really, as Commissioner Craddock, Chairwoman Craddock said, it is the innovation that is done by your industry. Whoa.
Well, hello and good morning
Good
again.
morning. I know.
It is the innovation that is done by your industry that brings light to this this debate. So
Well
thank you-
timed.
Thank you for including me, and look forward to the rest of the discussion.
Dr. Burgess, I want to build on those comments and just ask you to talk a little further about HR 1, which is this very robust package that was just passed by the House. This was no small undertaking. It has important provisions, as you mentioned, about permitting, about access to public lands for oil and gas development, about limiting states' ability to use the Clean Water Act to stop infrastructure permitting. The bill is now off to the Senate. Senate Leader Schumer has said the bill as now drafted is dead on arrival. And so I wanted to get your views on whether there is a path to bipartisan agreement on some of these topics and what happens next for this proposal.
Yes, is a short answer. There is a path. Well, look, this was a big bill. It wasn't as big as some of the other bills that have been done the past couple of years, but this bill would allow for some rationalization for the infrastructure, the building. Natural gas pipelines, which have been a problem. When I talked to Jim Wright, another commissioner, he's concerned about the stranded gas in the Permian Basin. How do we get that out to our cities that need to generate electricity, or to our LNG ports to export it around the world? And the infrastructure is what is obviously going to be needed. So this building of pipeline infrastructure, which has been rendered more difficult. Now, I do want to correct one thing. It doesn't negate anything that's in current NEPA law. It doesn't negate anything that's in the Clean Water Act. All it does is says there must be a standard path forward. And in fact, there are some enforceable timelines associated with it. And the idea is that you want people to, if there are problems, whether it be at the state level or local level, you want them to be, all stakeholders at the table from the beginning. You don't want someone holding back and then at the very end saying, no, you can't do it because of this, that, and the other. The other part of that is FERC is the lead agency on that. And there's a purpose in that, because at the end of the 90-day time that is going to be enforced, FERC will either have to report back to Congress that the project is on its way forward, or why not, and Congress then will have an opportunity to act on that.
Yeah, so I think we hear this over and over again, the need for predictable, reliable, streamlined process to get to yes on some of these major infrastructure projects. I saw the White House Council on Environmental Quality puts out statistics on this and has done so over the last 10 years. So the most recent one was in 2020. And in that it said that most projects that go through the NEPA process in the U.S. take 4.5 years on average. Some of those are way longer, 10 years and more. And so that's the problem that you all are trying to solve for, I think, both at the state level and the federal level. So I want to ask each of you to talk a little bit about your efforts to improve the way that the permitting process works, the way that government authorizes some of these major infrastructure projects, both on the state side and the federal side. Commissioner Craddock, maybe I'll start with you on that. I know that you've championed improvements within the state that would speed up inspections and permitting at the RRC. There have also been some recent efforts in the state to consolidate permitting authority within the state agencies. Can you talk a little bit about the efforts here in Texas to improve the state's regulatory role for infrastructure?
So we applaud what Congressman's trying to do, because let me say, the difference between what we do permitting wise and what goes on federally, they don't like what we're saying this morning. It is a big difference. So here's a good example of what we can do at the state versus what Congress is trying to get to, I think. Today, if you come for a drilling permit at the Railroad Commission, We can do it in 48 hours. If you go in and you're at Bureau of Land Management, of which we have a lot of drilling on federal lands, particularly in New Mexico, for instance, it takes them up to a year to get a drilling permit out. That's a huge difference. Or when you're talking about pipelines. Look, we have about 500,000 miles of pipe in Texas alone, interstate, and gathering lines. That's a lot of pipeline. A pipe can be built, and we don't get into siting in this state. We think that's not what we should be doing. We do work with PHMSA. We think, obviously, having good regulations and making sure safety's involved, that's important to the state. But we don't get into siting, which is a little bit different than FERC. But a pipeline can be built in this state in 2 years. An interstate pipe takes a lot longer. And so having some certainty would be great, we think, just dealing with federal agencies as well. We've got the same challenge. So part of what we want to make sure that continues to happen in Texas, and see, we don't have a lot of federal lands. It is a plus for Texas in a lot of respects. But we want to make sure that our regulatory world is fair and consistent. Part of that, when you're talking about our updates, we're on an IT upgrade. Some of you have heard me talk about this. When I got to this agency now almost 11 years ago, we were on and are still working through that, on a mainframe with Fortran. We have a library and hard copy half the size of this room, almost the size of this room, with microfilm and microfiche. Not very effective, not very transparent, and not very smart time-wise when you're trying, and very efficient when you're trying to get things done. We're in the middle of an IT upgrade. We're in phase 1's finished, phase 2's well on its way, and we've gone and asked for money for phase 3, and we'll, by phase 4, which is about 4 years from now, we will be finished with, at least with this upgrade, and not be logging in with Novell anymore, and doing all sorts of, half this room has no idea what I just said, by the way, I get that. Go look at the gray-haired people, they'll tell you what Fortran is. So we are really upgrading because we want to be able to be more transparent and more efficient in our permitting. We're also, look, I think the biggest challenge that any of us have permitting-wise when you're looking at any project has to do with the environmental piece. Whether you're looking at endangered species, whether you're having to look at what EPA asks you to do, Department of Interior, permitting and in the environmental part takes time. And it should be smart about how we do it. But we do have, and the legislature has put in place for us in some places, timelines of when we have to get things done. That makes a lot more sense, and where I think our sister agency, TCEQ, is trying to figure that piece out as well. If they aren't doing one part of it, because some projects you have to have permits from both agencies, or today we're working on Class 6 wells, which are injection wells for carbon. Today you have to go to EPA and the Railroad Commission. We've applied to EPA for primacy. That application went up December 19th. There's 2 other states that have managed to get it done, and Louisiana's is finally moving its way up the food chain after 2 years of sitting. We hope ours doesn't sit for 2 years. We think there's a real opportunity for this state. We've got every piece that you need, whether it's the pipelines, whether it's the storage space. We're ready to do that project. Those projects, we think it makes sense, and we can do it a lot quicker. If you want to invest, that's what industry needs, is to look for, they want to go where you can invest and where there's innovation. And I'll just say, to back up for 1 second, I agree with the congressman. The most important thing I think we've done in this state and in this country is allow us to sell unrefined products overseas in 2015. Totally changed this industry in the country. And why? We say all the time, you can drill as much as you want, but if you cannot get it to market, it doesn't matter. Hence, you need pipelines, you need roads in the state, you need railroads, you need ports that are fully funded that can get product to market. And look, everybody wants our product. Nobody, if you go look at Ukraine, they really want us to give oil and gas and to that part of the world. And our first LNG, when you're talking about LNG, that we had to reverse a terminal, we built one, Louisiana had, and they flipped it. The first LNG from out of this country went to Poland. So the history says everybody wants our natural gas. We're the fourth largest natural gas country in the world. Let's go do business. And I think innovation really makes a difference with consistent regulation.
Just, Dr. Burgess, I want to ask you to add to that the federal permitting piece. And you mentioned natural gas pipelines, and maybe let's talk about that, because I think that's a particularly challenging type of infrastructure. Can you talk about some of the policy changes that you think are needed there? And I know you have two separate legislative proposals specific to that.
Well, I would stress that in the bill that just passed in HR 1, I mean, it doesn't diminish any of the NEPA regulations. I mean, they're all still there. Categorical exclusion is still a categorical exclusion. A project that requires an environmental assessment is still going to require an environmental assessment, and one that's going to require an EIS is still going to require an EIS. So none of that actually changed as far as the basic NEPA law. The only thing that changed was people need to get together at the start and have their grievances heard and work on the mitigation side of it, and don't wait until the last minute. And as you all know better than I, a big project can look like it's sitting on go and then end up in the court somewhere, and you don't see it again for a number of years. That's what we're trying to get around. The innovation in this country is really, it is incredible what the industry has done. And it's not so much that you're exporting the technology, but you're exporting cleaner energy than any other country can produce it. So when people say, "Oh my gosh, we're going to shut it down here because we just don't think it's a good idea," but the energy is going to come from somewhere, and goodness knows you've seen that in Europe with the disaster that's going on in the Ukraine right now. But the energy comes from somewhere. So if it comes from Russia, that means pipelines that leak a ton more methane than anything in this country would leak. Why wouldn't you buy the energy from the absolutely cleanest source? And that, of course, is the United States of America. And you all have the technology that you have developed is really puts us head and shoulders above the rest of the world.
I want to stay on the topic of technological innovation and ask each of you to comment on how state and federal policy can help encourage that or help foster the development of new technologies. And Commissioner Craddock, I'll start with you. One of the examples of this consolidation of state authority that I mentioned is in the area of CCUS, carbon capture, utilization, and storage. Last September, the Texas legislature voted to give your commission, the Texas Railroad Commission, sole jurisdiction in the state over carbon sequestration wells. That was previously shared with the Texas CEQ. And the RRC has now applied for enforcement primacy for federal Class 6 underground inspection control program with the federal government. Can you talk a little bit about how these actions, both within the state and your proposal with the federal government, can help foster the development of this technology here in Texas?
So we always I always think that people think carbon capture is new. Well, again, we started it in Texas. So we in Texas have allowed since the early 2000s in this state, we've been capturing carbon and putting it back into oil fields. This isn't new, and that permitting goes through Texas, the Texas Railroad Commission. So we believe that carbon capture is another piece to that. It's why it made sense to put it at the Railroad Commission. We've been doing it. We know how to do it. You're doing injection wells. We do this. We permit injection wells. We know how to do it. And so the legislature last cycle said, okay, whether you agree with capturing carbon or not, we see a business opportunity and it ought to go to the Railroad Commission. So we, again, have applied, and we appreciate the help we've gotten from some of our congressmen. I think, Congressman, you've written a letter for us. We've had others that are supporting our application as of December 19th, and our application looks about like this to get primacy from the EPA. EPA doesn't always love states right now, and oil and gas states are having a little bit of a challenge working with them, so we really want this project to move forward and to have that opportunity in Texas to lead. Again, Wyoming and North Dakota have gotten it. That's great. Louisiana's trying to, but when you're looking at pore space and opportunities, not only do we have it in Texas onshore, but offshore. And Scott Tinker with BEG, they've done a lot of research about what we have all over the state. And offshore, we have as many opportunities, pore space, as we do onshore in Texas. So we think Texas should be a leader. You're looking, if you go to Houston or to our Gulf Coast, look at the carbon that's sitting there. Look at the opportunities, and you've got companies that are leading, whether it's Oxy or it's Shell or it's Exxon or others that are leading in this space. Well, all their offices are sitting in Texas too. So we see a real opportunity in Texas. We think it's a challenge, though, to get this permit process moving through the EPA. And so today, if you want to get, like I said earlier, if you want to get a CCUS, a Class 6 permit, you've got to not only come to us, but you've got to go to EPA. We have friends that have had their permits sitting up there for 2 years. That's not realistic. If the stated policy of the federal government is that you want CCUS to be captured and stored, then you can't wait 2 years, right? You've got to move forward a lot quicker and smarter. So we think the Railroad Commission can do that, and we'll be a leader across the country if we can get our permit moving.
Dr. Burgess, I want to ask you about the Energy Efficiency and Conservation Summit that you host. This is an annual gathering that you host to highlight technological innovations in various types of energy sources. In the past, you've highlighted Energy Star, hybrid and alternative fueled vehicle policies, the development of alternative energy sources, and manufacturing of different parts related to that here in Texas, solar panels in Keller, wind turbine blades in Gainesville. I wanted to ask you what role you think some of these new technologies are playing in our domestic energy mix, and what role do you see them playing in the future?
Well, first, let me just go back and Commissioner Craddock said it so well, but Texas was the leader back when Michael Williams was a railroad commissioner, and he came and talked to us and said, Texas is going to take title of the carbon, and from just the liability aspects going into the future, that was such a huge step, and you've built on it, and that's a good thing. To get the permitting streamlined only decreases the cost of those projects, and as you know, the cost of capital is sometimes the limiting factor. Yes, I do an energy efficiency summit in the district. I usually do it in July when people's air conditioning bills are the highest, figuring that's going to be the capture mechanism that I use. But the idea is not so much to educate people about policy at the Department of Energy. Yes, it is to showcase some of the things we're doing in the district with solar panels and wind turbines. But my primary goal is to educate people to become good energy consumers and to be critical in their thinking. What started off as a summit that talked about the efficiency of HVAC systems and the importance of making certain that you didn't have holes in your insulation really has sort of morphed now into a car show. I would have never believed back, I think it was in 2006 or 2007, one of the car dealers asked if they could bring a Nissan Leaf to this thing. And I said, yeah, sure, it's Texas. Nobody's going to buy an electric car. Are you crazy? But it really has developed. The Tesla Club of Denton shows up, and they have all kinds of their latest models. The Ford Lightning now is always on display, and that's a big one. So it really has changed. The nature of it has changed over the years. But the principle is the same. I want people to think about the dollars that they're spending on energy, where they can invest those dollars perhaps more efficiently or wisely. And then, energy efficiency is kind of the common ground of perhaps the two extremes in energy policy. No one can argue that from a political standpoint that it is going to be good policy to waste energy. No, that's wasting money, and no one should be making that argument. But I have continued to do that. There seems to be a lot of genuine enthusiasm in the district for people to learn about these things, and we have good participation by some of our electricity providers. CoServe and Denton Municipal Electric have participated. So it has been a learning experience for constituents in order to be more wise purchasers of energy.
So I want to shift gears now to a related topic, but focus on a different issue that came up earlier in your remarks, and that's the role of policy, both state policy and federal policy, in ensuring a stable domestic energy supply in response to various external events. And we have some recent examples of how important that is. Commissioner Craddock, I'll start with you and ask you to comment on the lessons learned from the ice storms in Texas that disrupted supply both here and nationwide. I think something up to 68% of Texans lost power for a few days in the aftermath of those storms, and you and the commissioners were in the front lines of dealing with that crisis and have adopted some policies in response to it. Can you talk a little bit about the lessons learned from that event and how both state and federal policymakers can help guard against that in the future?
So Winter Storm Uri was a big challenge for the state, and I was one of those who lost power too for 5 days, so I don't want to do it again, by the way, although Austin Energy did not make my life that much easier a few weeks ago. So that being said, as we came out of Winter Storm Uri, what we realized were a couple of things. One, we as an agency at the Railroad Commission regulate the local distribution companies, meaning the gas utilities that go to your house. Those companies are required to have gas show up at your house, just like we would like electricity companies to have electricity show up at your house. The gas utilities are regulated by us as an agency, and we only lost across the state 2,700 customers during that time period, meaning the gas showed up. It flowed across the state. Now, they paid for it. You and I paid for it. Customers are paying for it. But the gas showed up, so there's reliability within that system. So as we came into this, it's always happens, seems to have happened when the legislative session in Texas is on every other year. We have some crisis of energy, and so and they'd only been going for about a month, which meant they had to do something, which is good. So we moved forward, and our agency came to the table with certain things that we thought were important. And I thought I'd highlight a couple of those because I think it's allowing all of us, and I see one of our ERCOT members sitting out here with Bill Flores, it's allowing all of us to work together better, and I think address some issues. So first and foremost, we said you ought to map what critical infrastructure is in the state. What we realized during Winter Storm Uri is a couple of things. Innovations happened out in the oil and gas industry, and now there's a lot more electricity happening and electric things going on in the oil field. ERCOT and the PUC had no idea that was going on at that point 2 years ago. They didn't realize the growth that had happened in this industry, not just how much we'd grown in the Permian Basin and in South Texas, but how much more we're relying on electricity across the state. So those communications have happened. We've mapped our infrastructure, and it's a living map, by the way, because we're drilling oil wells, we're building pipelines, there's more infrastructure being built, so we want to make sure that that is a living map that we agree on between 3 agencies, and we agree on it twice a year. So we agree on it in about April and September, so we know what we're looking at and what we all ought to be prepared for. The other thing that was put into statute that we suggested is called this Texas Energy Reliability Council. So my agency has always had this, or for many years, has had this ad hoc group that we get industry, pipeline operators, all of us as an agency, different parties, and we have during storm events, and I say storm events because we talk about winter, but it also is summer too. We have storm events. We get on the phone and have a conversation and say, I've got having a bottleneck over here, or my storage is down over here, or we're doing great today. We don't need any help. We were having those conversations as an agency very regularly, and do that. We suggested that be part of a statute. So we all, not just the PUC, not just ERCOT, not just the Railroad Commission, but also TxDOT, Department of Emergency Management, I call it the ABC alphabet soup group, now all sits in a room and has a conversation or gets on the phone, and it's daily when we're having a storm event. So it also is during hurricanes too. We're going to be activated during both winter storm and hurricane events, separate from our emergency management world, and talk about specific energy challenges we've got going on that day, or where we may or may not. And we've got LNG is now in the room. Other groups that are very important to all of us. So we're not only looking at the map, we're having conversations. So if there's an issue in some spot, all parties can go say, okay, we'll get offline and we'll go help you so we can keep the power on, we can keep the gas moving. So those two things I think have been a real positive for the state. As a regulator, we're now having better conversations. And I think that's really a challenge for a lot of agencies. Look, our IT doesn't speak to each other. We don't always communicate, and we all silo. And I think that's the real challenge as a state. And frankly, as a governmental entity, you've got to have communication with not just your other agencies, but with relevant parties that are trying to help move the problem and solve the solutions. And what we've seen from that and from Winter Storm Uri, not only has industry, and the PUC's got its own plan, and ERCOT's got its own plan for how we do electricity better, but what has allowed us all is in the energy sector is figure out how we work together better, but also we're developing new products. So for instance, in Texas, storage is really important, not just carbon, but we store natural gas in this state all over. Well, a lot more natural gas storage has developed without the regulatory bodies being involved because there was a market for that. Innovations occurring in the electricity world, that there are more innovative products going on because we see an opportunity. So I think good regulation is important, but also allowing for innovation, whether it's in the electricity and natural gas market, or we said our biggest challenge, I know it's not our issue for all over today, but our biggest challenge is if you're in the oil and gas industry, you're not in the oil and gas industry, you're in the fluids industry. So water is as big an issue that we deal with as an agency as anything else we do. Innovation's a big piece of how we're going to manage that going forward as well.
Absolutely. Thank you for sharing that with us. I want to ask both of you, and maybe we'll start with Dr. Burgess to comment on the role of federal and state policies in ensuring energy supply security and domestic energy security. And that's especially in the face of global turmoil. Something that came to the fore with Russia's invasion of Ukraine and the spike in gas prices at the pump that everyone experienced in the U.S. So policymakers across the government have been focused on this. Dr. Burgess, last fall you published an op-ed in which you discussed the importance of regaining energy independence in the aftermath of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. So can you talk a little bit about what the importance of how we get to that point?
Sure, and thank you for mentioning that. It's still available online. It is brilliant. I encourage everyone to look that up. But look, we went from a situation in December of 2020 when energy was abundant and affordable and really gave us geopolitical security in this country that we kind of hadn't seen since the Arab oil embargo. I mean, it was phenomenal where this country was in December of 2020. Somehow, over the next 2.5 years, that was deemed unimportant, and we went in a completely different direction, and it has exposed why, from a geopolitical standpoint, you want to have energy security. You want to have energy independence. You want to have energy dominance in the world. There have been so many examples. Ukraine is a particularly bad one because of the intense human suffering that is going on. But look at how quickly Germany figured out how to cite the importation of liquefied natural gas in the face of what was happening with the sanctions on Russia and then the disruption of the Nord Stream 2. And I'm sorry, if you want to talk about methane emissions, what in the heck about that Nord Stream 2? Why is no one raising Billy Kane about that? It seems like that source of methane emissions was absolutely dwarfs anything that might be coming out of where you all are producing energy in this state. Forgive me for that diversion. But the geopolitical security that we enjoyed as a country just a few short years ago was something that should not have been so easily given up. Now, part of what the measure that just passed in Congress, and I hope has an opportunity to go forward, what that's geared toward is reclaiming or regaining some of that stability in the world. Those of us who are old enough to remember the Arab oil embargo, remember how unpleasant that was and how difficult that was for our daily lives. But it also, the ripple effects throughout the world were also very significant. We had an opportunity at the end of 2020 to continue an energy dominance that really hadn't been seen in decades, but for whatever reason decided to go in a completely different direction. Now, like so many things, it's not irredeemable. You can catch back up. And one of the things the commissioner said that is so critical about Texas is our growth. It's not just that, hey, we want energy from this source or that source. We need a lot of it. It's all of the above and more, please, because there are so many people moving to our state because of the favorable economic climate, the political stability, I would argue the good congressional representation that's available in this state. But our state is growing, and that is a good thing. And we need to be able to be prepared to meet the demands of that growing population. So throughout the country, it's not all the same. It's not a one-size-fits-all. That's why we're fortunate to have a state regulatory agency like the Railroad Commission to help us plan the way forward for our state, which has unique challenges, unique demands, and a lot more growth than other parts of the country.
Great. Chair Craddock, anything to add on that?
Well, I was going to say thank you. We're trying to, but he's right. We are getting about 1,000 people a day are moving to Texas, so it isn't just we're now at 30 million people. We need to have consistent regulatory availability. But I think where we're missing and have an opportunity, and I thought Scott Tinker said it well this morning. If you were here, the policy shift since December of 2020 in this country has been a real challenge, not just for people in the industry, but across the world. So there we've got negative policy, and people don't happen to like the oil and gas industry. Okay, but it's not going away. So at some point, and I think it's coming in 5 years, for the next 5 to 10 years, we won't have invested enough in this, not just oil and gas, but in the energy space, period, that we're going to be behind. And that's going to be the real problem. And every time we found, if you look at history, when the U.S. gets behind in something, somebody else comes in and fills it, and it causes instability. So you're seeing that whether it's Russia or China today, we're getting behind in our energy space, and I think that's a real negative for the world long term.
So I want to give the audience a chance to ask some questions. Before I do that, I just want to ask one final wrap-up question of both of you. We've talked a lot about the big policy issues that are front of mind today. If we were to convene this panel 10 years from now, what do you think or hope that the top policy concern for Texas energy industry will be in the future?
Well, I think we haven't really talked much about nuclear this morning. I think in 10 years, that would be a higher topic of discussion. Yes, there are technological advances that are occurring in the small modular reactor space, and that is a good thing. It's taken longer than anyone thought possible. But I also think it is short-sighted to not pay attention to what I call the legacy nuclear production that is going on in this country, like the South Texas project by Houston and Comanche Peak up in my neck of the woods. These plants that have been around for a long time have quietly producing energy without a lot of flashiness or headlines, but the concept of decommissioning or allowing those licenses to expire really, it just makes no sense. If you're looking for low carbon sources of energy, nuclear energy should be front of mind. Now, the good news is that the plants that are the legacy plants that I'm aware of in Texas are continuing to function. I think there is some effort to relicense those plants, and that is a good thing. Congress, unfortunately, has not figured out how to handle or how to deal with long-term nuclear storage, and that is an obstacle that will need to be surmounted. Some type of reuse program is likely to be something that is going to be, we'll be talking about 10 years in the future. But truly, if you're going to talk about a low carbon future, it is going to have to include nuclear. But I guess I'd further say that, so much of what I see and what I hear from, the political back and forth in the committee, in the Energy Committee, in the House of Representatives is, we focus way too much on the source. We ought to be focused on the emissions. And again, that's where I think your industry, the technological advances of your industry, and what is happening in the state of Texas really seems to have struck the right balance on that. You just can't look at only source. It has to be emissions.
Well, I would say I agree with the nuclear. I think Texas is trying to figure out how to be innovative, and we've got some small projects going on. But I think the bigger issue long-term for this industry and the state and the country, quite frankly, is water. So we're in a high-growth state. Frankly, the western part of the United States is growing. We've got to figure out what to do with water policy. We're behind in that in this country, and it's not just desal, it is figuring out how to use it smarter, use less of it. And look, this industry, the oil and gas industry, only uses 2% of the state's water. That's not much. The agriculture industry uses about over 50%. Municipalities use 30%. Water's going to be a real issue. If we don't have water, it doesn't matter what we're doing. So innovation, not just in the water space, but I think whatever new energy technology and continuing to allow that innovation across the country and across the world is going to be really important policy-wise for us.